Hey, what's up Beam Tribe? James from Brisbane here. So in this video we're going to talk about the hip hinge movement pattern. So what it is, why it's important, and then in some future videos we're going to take you through how to do it and some different variations to challenge strength, balance and mobility. So the hip hinge is a fundamental movement pattern and it is the foundation for a lot of really important skills such as deadlifting and squatting. And it's also a really important strategy to have on the beam, especially when you're in ninja stance. So essentially the hip hinge is moving your hips independently of your spine and your knees. So I'll just show you what it looks like quickly from the side. This is a hip hinge. So you can see that my spine doesn't move, my knees don't move, only my hips hinge backwards and then come back up. So the reason this is important is because our hips are really the primary engines of our body, and they are a large ball and socket joint, so they can express a large range of motion, and they're also surrounded by big strong muscles like the glutes and hamstrings and psoas. So when it comes to any movement that requires power or explosiveness or a good amount of strength, then the hips should be the preferred drivers of that movement. And that's because they can tolerate the most amount of load, especially compared to the knees and the back, and also because they can perform the best, they can express the most strength and power. Now this of course doesn't mean that we shouldn't load our knees or our spine, and quite the contrary, we do need to load our knees and our back through their fullest range of motion possible in order for them to be strong and functional and healthy. And it's certainly not a bad thing to move with your spine or move with your knees like this. But what it does mean is that we need the option to be able to move at our hips independently of the other two, so that we can load the hips when we want to, and we can still load the knees and the spine when we want to, but it's about having the option. And that's because using hip rotation or hip-centric movement scales up very well. That's why you'll always see Olympic weightlifters or powerlifters, they always use their hips as the primary engine because it scales up very well in terms of different or higher loads and higher weight. And also because we need a good amount of variability. So if you don't have the option to move at your hips and you're always either moving at your knees or your back, then often this can lead to overload of those areas over a long period of time, and that can lead to things like pain and injury and just poor performance in general. So these days, the majority of people actually don't have access to the hip hinge movement pattern. And I've found this to be true, especially in my physiotherapy practice when it comes to people with knee pain or back pain. I've found that they often struggle with using the hip hinge movement pattern. And what this really comes down to is the fact that we have such a sedentary culture. So we're sitting a lot, we're not using the hips the way they were designed to be used. And most people just don't need to do any higher load activities in their day-to-day life, and they are never taught how to use their hips properly, even in physical education at school or even on the job education, especially if it's manual labor or anything. Most people aren't actually taught how to hip hinge properly, and so most people don't have access to it. So go through the tutorials in the tools section, and we'll take you through from a very basic hip hinge all the way to some advanced variations. I really recommend you practice the basics quite a lot, even if you've already been taught to hip hinge or deadlift. It's very helpful to go through the basics with a beginner's mind and focus on slow and mindful movement to make sure that your technique is really crisp and really on point, and then over time that will really help build a good foundation for a lot of different movements and challenges and tasks on the beam that use the hip hinge as a movement. At first it'll feel like work to be programming this into your brain or relearning how to hip hinge, and it'll be challenging, but when you work through that phase, then you'll be able to play with the movement in a lot of different ways and it can become a lot of fun. So look forward to seeing you in those tutorial videos. See you then.